Hi, and welcome to the latest horror chat. I'm delighted to have with us today Jonathan L. Howard. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hello.
Hello. I've had the privilege of meeting Jonathan in person, and that was, gosh, almost 2 years ago in Bristol.
It's staggering. I can't hardly believe it's 2 years.
I know, right? Isn't that crazy? And at that time, you gave me this beautiful book, Kith the Taker, that you
I'm glad you liked it.
it not only did I like it, but it powerfully influenced a story I created after that. So thank you again. And Kit the Taker, while not strictly horror, it does have horror elements and is a dark fantasy. And Kith is quite the mercenary. So this was a great
Hmm.
book for me. Um, so thanks again. So I'm going to read a little bit of your bio and then we'll jump into some questions. You
Oh, the
can
horror. Okay, go.
confirm or deny. It's okay. So in the early 90s, you were working as a scriptwriter and video game writer, and
Hmm.
you had writing credits on highly successful Broken Sword series of video games. Very cool. And then you had your first novel published in 2009, Johannes Cabal, the Necromancer, which I love that name. And then a whole series of those, right? So then you had the Necromancer, the Detective, the Fear Institute, the Brothers Cabal, Blustery Day and Other Tales as a collection, and the Fall of the House of Cabal. And then lots of short fiction over the years. And is it Rusalka Chronicles?
Yeah, the Rusalka Chronicles.
Rusalka
Uh,
Chronicles, Catch His World, Catch His War, Carter and Lovecraft series, and very cool. And Kit the Taker, of course,
mhm.
we mentioned. So I'd love to know, you've got this rich history of doing horror and fantasy and screenwriting. You've done a lot of wonderful things, but I wanted to know, related to horror, when did you know or at least suspect that you wanted to write it?
Write it. That's a tricky one. I don't think there's any particular moment where I decided, yes, I'm going to write horror. It was just, um, I've always been the one to generate stories ever since I was a kid. And actually thinking back to it, back in ooh, class 5 at my primary school, Miss Hodgkinson's class. I remember writing a story about ghosts there. So I would have been about 7, 8, I suppose. So, I mean, it was always there. I've always been fascinated by monsters in particular. I do like a good monster, or indeed a bad monster, pretty much any monster. But again, one of my earliest memories when I was very small, maybe 3 years old, my brother had picked up a pack of um, trading cards,
Yeah,
and I don't know what they were. I'm pretty sure that one of them was the Blob, another one was something from the
nice.
Outer Limits and things like this. And they had really lurid colors because a lot of these were from black and white things,
Yeah.
not the Blob, obviously, but a lot of them from black and white things, and they'd been hand colored in a really lurid spectrum. And as a tiny, looking at these things all agog and excited, and
Yeah.
the expectation that there's this world of horror and science fiction and stuff just out there, and I wasn't old enough quite yet to see it, but one of these days. And so that was sort of easing into the world of horror. Yeah, I think I always wanted to write horror even before I realized that writing was a thing that normal mortals could actually do. And sad to say, I am a normal mortal
Yeah, but you're a creative.
despite expectations. But there you go.
Well, not one of the elder gods. What?
I know, unless I'm a particularly duplicitous avatar of Niall of the Tap, and anything is possible, let's be honest.
Anything. So, and so you talked a bit about some of these great sort of B movies and things like that, but
Mm.
what else influenced you in horror in books or shows or films?
Uh, well, I am slightly older, very slightly, only a few weeks older than Doctor Who. That's Doctor Who, the TV series, as opposed to Doctor Who, the character. I'm not that old. But so I grew up with Doctor Who. I grew up in through a period that's known in the UK as Dalek Mania in the late
Nice.
60s, where everything was Daleks. And in 1973, one of my fondest things that was bought for me was a 10-year anniversary kind of anniversary magazine that the BBC produced, and it was just full of stuff, and a story that had been written by Terry Nation, creator of the Daleks,
Cool.
especially for this, and it had a story by story breakdown of all of Doctor Who, including ones that I had been far too young to remember at the time, but what others that I'd remembered, and because I was tiny when I was watching them, I didn't really understand what was going on. So going through this thing and it building up in my mind. So certainly Doctor Who was a hugely formative influence.
A lot of monsters in it too, actually.
Well, yes. I mean, the 60s, there's a season, 1968 season, I think, which is known as the Year of Monsters, because every story was hung on assorted monsters, and there were some great designs.
Yeah, there were.
Put together on a tiny budget, but some really nice designs.
Yeah.
So there's that from a point of view of television. And also television in the 60s and into the 70s, in Britain at least, was very, very peculiar.
Mm-hmm.
It was just full of odd series and things that were or it looked like they were designed to traumatize almost. I loved all of that stuff, so I was quite happy with that. For books, I suppose my local library, the children's section, which my tickets only let me take up books from the children's bit, but somewhere along the timeline of that particular library, one of their librarians must have been a bit of a renegade, because the children's library contained some stuff which you look at it and go, that's an interesting choice.
Yay.
Including Tales of Mystery and Imagination, Edgar Allan Poe.
Excellent.
So I first read Poe at the age of 8.
Yeah.
There was a collection called something like Adventure Stories for Boys or things, which had quite a lot of horror in it. It had M.R. James' Wailing Well, which is pretty full on, and it had Ray Bradbury's The Lighthouse, which is a story that spawned Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. So it had horror and supernatural elements in it. The ventriloquist doll stories in there as well. Yeah. Thank you, local library, and whichever librarian went, yeah, let them look at this, because they're the kids' library. So I was reading that, and that got me directly into Ray Bradbury, actually. I exhaustively read Ray Bradbury.
Huge influence on me and that. I'm just steeped in Bradbury, so yeah.
Yeah, I read everything up to I haven't read some of his later stuff. He did some detective stories in his later career, and I read a couple of those, but not much after that. One of the little things that makes me very happy is Johannes Cabal, the necromancer, was strongly influenced by Something Wicked This Way Comes. In fact, I say as much in the acknowledgements, the idea of where do evil carnivals come from in the first place, and how you're supposed to run one, and that's essentially what Johannes Cabal the Necromancer is about. And my editor at Doubleday for that knew Bradbury's agent and sent him a copy via them, and I got a very nice email from Ray Bradbury. He was virtually blind by that point, so he'd had chunks of it read out to him, and it was really, really nice. He was very complimentary about it. At least the chunks that were read out to me was
fantastic.
Yeah, so that made me very happy. What I didn't know until a few years ago was that my inbox has a 10-year life, and it automatically erased it 10 years after. Yeah, in 2019 it erased it. So you've only got my word for it that Ray Bradbury liked Johannes Cabal the Necromancer, but I know he did.
Yeah, and now the rest of the world knows too.
Well, yes, the rest of the world.
Yeah. So you've got that wonderful background, that rich sort of almost allegorical set of influences there in a lot of ways. It's bled itself to your writing, and I noticed that in Kit the Taker as well. which I just love, because there's a darkness there, and it's a horror within kind of situation of facing your own darkness and finding it no matter when and where, so to speak. But I really love that. I love that you've dug into that. But I also wanted to, like, can we talk a little bit about game writing and how that may have, how has that shaped your long fiction, prose, or your short fiction? You know, do you think it's bled itself in that way a bit into your prose?
I'm not sure it has. The game writing is a very particular discipline. Um, but on the plus side, if it taught me anything, it was that I'm capable of knocking out large word counts.
Yeah, that matters.
Um,
Right.
it does matter. It matters enormously, and having the confidence to go, this is umpteen thousand words. When I was at university and we were asked to write a 5,000 word essay, the whole lecture theatres as well, what, 5,000? Oh, you'd say
Yeah,
now
right.
5,000 is nothing to me. And it was games industry that taught me that 5,000 is nothing.
Yep.
And once you get past 5,000, then you can make 20. And once you get past 20, you can get to 60 or 80, whatever novel length you're looking at. So it taught me to have confidence and in my ability to write a novel, and also to anticipate that there will be, that it does occasionally feel like it's turning into a bit of a death march. It always
Yeah.
does. I mean,
Always does.
the second act blues are well known. Getting through all that, but if games writing taught me anything, it was purely that I can write.
Yeah. And right on demand, like journalism for me has been that regard too. You know, you
Mm,
pump it out, even though it's entirely different subject matter, it still translates. And I think you hit it on the head with the confidence of it. You know, if you can write one kind of thing, even if it's not the books or whatever, it definitely helps you write everything. You know, you just
mm.
get better across the board, more flexible in a way, like it's a muscle you're continually working, so to speak.
Exactly. It is a developed skill. It's like anything in life. If you want to get good at something, you just have to keep plugging away at it. And you
Just
may not notice yourself getting better, but you are getting better.
yeah, all the time, right?
Mm.
So like when you've talked about monsters, and I'm curious, you know, you mentioned Bradbury and sort of carnival stuff, but in terms of, are there any subgenres of horror that are particularly your favorite that you always just get really excited about?
I love puzzle stories.
Hmm.
I always have. And Kith started as my series character for puzzle stories, because the first of them, Beautiful Courage, is a flat out puzzle story. And to a large extent, the other two are as well. But it's the usual thing. Kiss started off. My intention was, she's basically a cipher. She's there to explain the story. She's basically a detective figuring out a puzzle of what's going on here.
Right.
And then you know what happens. Stuff accrues. Very awkwardly, she goes and develops a personality and a history and all the rest of it, and she goes off in her own direction. I mean, the fact that I planned out a Kith novel, which had a ton of her backstory in it, that just added to it. So that was later reflected in the later shorter stories.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, but puzzle stories, I love them. Again, if you look at the Johannes Cabal, the short stories, some of them, not all by any stretch of imagination, but they're hung on the idea of, here is an impossible situation, how do I get out of it? The last to date Cabal story, Fall of the House of Cabal, is like a puzzle machine almost. Lots of cogs and stuff whirring away like mad, and it's, what is this leading on to? Things like that. And I've got another series of short stories that I am very, very slowly writing, set in the same world as Kith the Taker.
Hey,
But it's not Kith, it's just the same world.
Bill, it's
That's
a
not to say
cool
Kith might
world.
not turn up at some point, but it's the idea is that it's a bunch of short stories each of which can stand alone, although each one builds on the one before it.
Right.
And there's an overarching plot that carries through it, but it's very much a picaresque, and each one is hung on we're in an impossible situation. How we're going to get out of this?
I love it.
Yeah, so me and puzzle stories like that.
Awesome. Love. And I have a sneaking suspicion that you might like Cthulhu. I wonder why.
Oh, good stuff, man. Yeah, my little green pal who's fun to be with. Yes, there we go,
There he
Cthulhu. There's
is.
another. There's a glow in the dark Funko Cthulhu up there as well.
Nice. Nice.
And I've got a Cthulhu miniature who's vast, which I'll paint one of these days. So yes, Lovecraft,
Yes.
problematical old Howard Phillips. Yeah,
Yeah, I've illustrated Cthulhu now like 4 times for as commissioned art, and I feel like I know the guy a little too closely, but
yes, it was again, Lovecraft is something I kind of backed into.
yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, he was a long time ago. This must be late 70s, I think. It was my brother's birthday, and I wanted to get him something, and I was in W. Smith's in Bolton in the book department, and they had these books. And one of them was the Horror in the Burial Ground, and the other one I think was Dream Quest of Unknown Gaddafi and Other Stories. And I thought, and they had really bizarre covers, and I thought, ooh. So I got those for him, and they didn't mesh with him at all. They just sat on his shelf for ages. I was a manic reader. I devoured everything. So these books just sitting there gathering dust, that this could not be allowed to stand. So I ended up reading them.
It was like,
and
no.
Yeah, and oddly enough, Cthulhu's not in any of those.
Yeah,
I think he gets name checked a couple of times, but he's not in any. And the Horror in the Burial Ground was a collection of nominally their stories that Lovecraft edited or rewrote, but in reality he rewrote them massively. They read purely like Lovecraft stories. But thinking about it, no, that's not the first Lovecraft I read. The first Lovecraft I read was another rewrite, which was it's another horror somewhere. The Horror in the Museum, which is another rewrite. Hazel Healed, possibly. I don't know. I'd have to look that up. But that was in one of the Pan books of horror, which were huge in the UK from the late 60s into the 70s. Edited by Herbert Van Faal. And this Horror in the Museum story was in one. And I'd got used to, as a kid, I wanted monsters. I was desperate for monsters. And I was reading ghost story collections, and those were great. They were full of ghosts, right? Fair enough. And I was reading the horror collections, and and as often as not, they were people being beastly to people. And where the monsters? There are no damn monsters. Then I reached the Horror in the Museum, and there's a monster. There's an actual monster. I was so excited, and that was my first brush with Lovecraft. You could depend on Lovecraft for monsters, and that's what kind of brought me in initially.
Yeah. So that was sort of like, I think I've heard you mention that you were fond of weird tales.
Yeah. Yes, it's my ambition to get something published in Weird Tales.
I hope you do.
Yeah.
Because now it's kind of rebooted, right? So
yeah. Well, the previous iteration of Weird Tales led fairly directly to Lovecraft being published, because I submitted the first Cabal short story, which was Johannes Cabal on the Blustery Day, to Weird Tales, and they turned it down. And then ages later, I mean, best part of a year later, me and names, George. I am awful with names. Schweitzer. I can't remember. Huge name, multiple Hugo Award winner, and all sorts. Anyway, he was involved with with George H. Sithers. That's it. Because somebody leapt into my mind. He got in touch because he said it wasn't right for weird tales, at least the way they envisaged weird tales. But he really liked the story, and he'd put it to one side. And now they had a new magazine launching, which was H.P. Lovecraft's Magazine of Horror. Would I like it to be printed in the first issue? Yes, please,
Ah,
I said. Yes. So yeah, and and he said, I really like this series, this character as a series character. Have you considered doing a novel? And I'd actually written the novel by that point, and I was getting
ah,
it placed. So I sent him the first 3 chapters, and he said, this is really good, but the opening is very dilatory. I'd possibly learned the wrong lessons from late Victorian and Edwardian horror story writers in that I liked having a bit at the beginning where it goes all the way around the houses, and then finally 3,000 words in starts to get actually latch onto the story. And I'd done this with this opening, and he went, yeah, just cut that. I went, yeah. And then it struck me that another friend who's a writer had said exactly the same thing, and I'd been kind
uh-oh.
of, no, it is my vision, but I was being
Hear it
ganged up
twice,
on.
you're like,
So
well,
I went, okay, maybe I'm in the wrong here. So I I cut that opening, and blow down, got an agent almost immediately, and he almost immediately flogged the book. So listen to people who know what they're talking about. It's
yeah,
the lesson there.
that is a very good lesson in all of this because, one of the purposes of my doing author chats across genres is to help writers at any stage kind of understand that, there are things that are beneficial to us, that feedback is beneficial. And
Yes.
sometimes you can take it or leave it, but sometimes if again repeatedly you're hearing it, then maybe it's time to consider.
Yeah, and a good editor is absolutely worth their weight in gold.
Yes,
It's
I totally agree because
listen to your editor, even if you don't entirely agree, they've still probably got a point.
right.
So even if you end up in a compromise position there, it's still something. So yeah, they didn't just wander in through the door. Um,
Yes.
they know their stuff. They've gone through their licks. They've got their wounds bared upon their arms and all this business. They know what they're talking about.
Exactly. Well, so, we're talking about all these really cool things that you've done, but I'm wondering, what are you currently, you mentioned a collection. What else are you working on?
Well, I've got a day job at the moment, which I'm in games writing again.
Oh, really?
I know, and I can't talk about the project
Oh,
because it hasn't been publicly announced yet.
well, I
But
hope
it's an
it's
interesting one.
cool.
It's an
Oh, good.
interesting one. The assorted stakeholders and the platform people, they're quite excited about it.
Excellent.
Um,
Congrats.
so yeah, so there's that going on. And I've also haven't signed a contract yet, but I'm probably going to be writing a novel which is for not one of my IPs. It's
Oh,
somebody else's IP, but I've been doing that. It's a pretty well known one, and again, I'm NDA'd. I can't discuss it.
something popped into my head as to what it might be, so I'm hoping that's it. Yeah,
But that'll be nice because
congrats
yeah,
to that too.
yeah. So they, I've done my pitches, and we've narrowed it down to one particular story, and they seem quite excited about that. So it's got to go to the IP holder, and if they green light it, then off we go.
Great. Well, so I'm curious now, like, let's talk about kind of some nuts and bolts of your process in terms of like when you're writing a book or short stories or what have you, what's your typical writing day like? How do you approach it?
Uh, a typical writing day, I just kind of wander into it as the day goes on. I feel such a fraud. I don't really have a process. I just write stuff down and it
What is your
happens.
process?
Yeah, I get up in the morning, I have a shower, I have a cup of coffee, I grump around on the internet for a while, being very outspoken on my political views. And then at some point I'll go, I suppose I ought to write something. And so then I'll write some stuff and I'll get to the end of that and go, well, it wasn't bad. Yeah, all right. And then I'll go off and do something else.
Yeah.
It's very organic, distressingly so. Um, I do have targets. I am a sucker for the the Excel sheet saying I've written this much,
I am too.
and
Yeah.
it feeds it into a graph, and here's a line, here's where you should be, and why aren't you on that line, Howard? And this kind of stuff. And I use that as a bit of a whip for
Yeah.
my own back, because if I don't have something prodding me a bit,
Accountability.
yeah, exactly. You've got to keep things rolling. I am and have a weekly target is a good place to be, because
Right.
you'll have off days. You'll always have off days. So having a daily
Absolutely.
target can be a bit dangerous. But even then, daily target, there's a minimum. I
Yeah.
always want to write at least 500 words just so it's moved on.
Yeah.
And then a good day, I'll be looking at 1,000, 2,000.
Great.
I'm not a mercurial writer because I've got a nasty habit of editing as I
Oh
go.
yeah.
The plus side of that is I hand in
Clean
very
copy.
clean
Yeah.
manuscripts. Editors have different editors at different publishers have said you hand in remarkably clean manuscripts, and so that's my superpower as far as that goes.
Pretty good, actually. Yeah. Good one to have.
I mean, they still need a lot of tweaking and whatnot, but I've had editors that go, "Wow, you should see some of the manuscripts I've seen handed in." It's like, yikes! But yours, they don't take that very much work, really.
Yeah. That's kind of the feedback I've had too, but you know, obviously like there's always something that needs to be fixed, but for the most part I don't edit as I go exactly. I mean, I'll look back at a chapter, but I won't hang on to it too much because I feel like I always need cleaner eyes for it, and I'm always really fatigued when I'm done with the chapter. So I just come back to it later, and then I edit it. Like I'll print it off and go through physically, edit it, and then fix it, and then So I tend to try to turn in clean copy because I mean either way it's going to get edited, but at least you don't have the most embarrassing stuff, perhaps.
Well, exactly. Even when even my clean copies that I turn in, they bounce back with some embarrassing stuff.
Oh,
Things where you've changed your mind about how to construct a particular sentence, and you've rewritten it, but you've only rewritten half of it. The number of times I've had it was go, this sentence doesn't actually make any sense what you were trying to say here, and I look at it and go, I haven't got the faintest idea. I'm just going to completely delete that entire
I've done that
sentence.
too.
Yeah, it happens to everybody.
Why it's gone.
Yeah, you'll be writing and you'll come up with this what seems to you at the time like a perfectly clear image, and then you write the image down, and a piece of wordplay or whatever, or you go, that's a nice bit of English there. That's great. I am very happy with that. And then you come back later and it's gibberish. You're
Yeah.
absolutely kidding yourself.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, fair, but with our worst critics, but again, we have to kind of listen to that. It's like, oh,
Exactly. I mean, you have to be your worst critic, because if you're not your worst critic, somebody else will do the job for you. So yeah.
sure. Yeah. So getting back into actually writing horror, like how do you scare or disturb with your writing? Do you have what place do you go to? Like, and you're like, yeah, this is going to be the sauce. This is going to be spooky. How do you know that when you're writing horror?
Oh, that's tricky. I mean, I don't really write. I've thought about this in the past and I wasn't able to answer myself on that occasion either. I don't really write for the effects. I don't write for, oh, this is going to gross people out. Well, for one thing, I don't really write body horror. That doesn't
Yeah.
appeal to me. That's not the kind of stuff I do. I have on occasion, but it's not really my forte. But I certainly don't think, oh, this is going to scare people. It's more like there's a cinema inside my head,
Yeah, same.
and
Yeah.
I'm just typing down or describing what's going on there. And on the cinema, that my imagination is bolting together from. It's like they've been in Wallace and Gromit, the wrong trouser, where they're building the railway track as they're
Yeah.
going. It's like that. It's practically putting together frames in my onboard cinema, and it's rumbling on, and it's what if I was watching this or reading this, what has got the right kind of unpleasant sound? And that's the thing with horror. Some of it, almost by definition, is unpleasant.
Yeah.
It makes you go, oh. not necessarily grossing you out, but making you feel a bit weird and a bit off.
Yeah.
Um, it's, I mean, this is the thing. I'm a huge fan of the Czech surrealist animator Jan Schwankmajer.
Hmm.
Um, he and he gets that feeling of being
Ooh.
stuff that's unnerving
Yeah.
as much as anything else. Probably my favorite film of all time is his 1987, 88 version of Alice in Wonderland, simply called Alice.
Cool.
And it reminds me of the stuff that went through my head when I was a kid,
Hmm.
because we were in, I have an older brother and an older sister, but there's a big age gap between us. My brother was 7 years older than me, so um, so I was in this bizarre situation where it was almost like being an only child
Yeah.
with
I'm the
these
youngest by
two,
several years too, so it is weird.
yeah,
You feel like an only child. Yeah.
yeah, which I didn't understand at the time because, of
I
course, I
did.
couldn't. How could I?
Right.
Um, but you're an only child, and at the same time, you're not a first. You're not a real only child. You're not a
Right.
first child. So the novelty value of having kids has worn off with your parents, and they're not doting on you.
So
And
true.
I grew up in this house with my mum busying herself around the house, doing house stuff, and I was left to my own devices
Left
most of the time.
alone. That sounds very familiar.
Yeah,
Coming up with
so
your own universe.
I'm washing around this house in the 1960s, and it latterly you could stick the TV on and throw your kid in front of it if that's so. But in those days, TV wasn't on for most of the day.
Oh, and there wasn't much choice either, you know.
Yeah, we had three channels,
Right.
and
Yeah.
they only during the day they only really transmitted around lunchtime.
Oh. Mm.
There was the news. There was a program in Welsh, which is usually public hum, and there was Watch with Mother, and that was my midday dose of television. So I'd sit there watching Bill and Ben or the Wooden Tops or something like that, and then it would finish, and it would go back to trade test transmission. Some girl doing noughts and crosses with a clown doll, and you just had to fill the days somehow.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so expensive exploring the house and finding odd corners and fixating on little oddities like the Hoover badge on the front of the washing machine
Mhm.
was this beautiful kind of iridescent crimson, deep red thing, and it looked like it was a button. And I used to press it, and nothing would happen because it was a badge. But I used to press it thinking it was some kind of secret button, and if you pressed it in a particular way, interesting things would happen because it looked like it should do something.
Yeah.
And you just fixated on tiny things around the house and junk and bric-a-brac and all the rest of it. And Schwankmeyer gets that very nicely in Alice, that sense of being in a house full of bits and bobs and trying to add them to your kind of inner life.
Yeah. I did that.
So yeah, that got a lot more psychological than I intended, but there you go.
I mean, it makes sense to me. You know, I grew up as the youngest, and then, you know, there's the empty nest, and it's like you're an only child, but there's also all the relics of the other kids sitting around the house, which are little mystery boxes in and of themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
you guys suddenly have access to that, all that stuff. And I always kind of built up stories around their ephemera that they left. And, you know, that either I would play with, or at least I would study, or I would read, or something like that. So that to me was like another form of entertainment, you know, just to kind of
Yeah,
their stuff.
I was too young to read at that point, but books fascinated me all the same, and I used to flick through them, just look at the pictures. And we had this big old edition of Grimm's fairy tales, and I
Oh yeah.
couldn't read it, but
Yeah,
it
the
was
red
full of
one right
pictures.
there.
There you
Oh,
go.
yeah, the original one.
It
Yep.
was full of engravings, and some of them were going, "What is going on in this picture? I don't really know what that is. Never mind, onto this kind of stuff." But that kind of a thing around. As you say, cast-offs from your elders. I had a toy box, which was just full of battered old Matchbox cars and a battered plastic supercar supercar was a Jerry Anderson series, same guy who did
Yeah.
Thunderbirds and all that guy.
Yeah.
It was very early 60s. I didn't see an episode of Supercar for a long time because they didn't they weren't on reruns. They didn't repeat the things. So I just had this battered supercar, and I was wondering, what's the story behind this? What is this thing? But yeah, it was all old, battered, broken toys. Because at that stage, my parents weren't they didn't have much in the way of money. Um, the cash flow didn't really pick up until the 1970s. So at that point, we're a fairly poor family, I guess.
Yeah.
Very blue collar.
Yeah.
Blue collar.
And mine was as well, actually. So, you know, it just different place, East Tennessee versus Southwest England. You're in the Bristol area.
Yep. Yeah, I grew up in the Northwest, though.
You did. Okay. I was going to ask, like you mentioned Welsh being on. Was that typical? You know?
It was, there was no Welsh channel at that point. So they just, the BBC being a public service broadcaster, they were like, we should do at least a Welsh program. And so there was one a day, and that went out at lunchtime. And it went out from transmitters in Wales, obviously, and along the Welsh marches, and signals in the northwest going to North Wales. So they transmitted that way. So my brother swears blind. I learned at an early age. I learned Welsh conversationally from watching these things. I have no memory of that, but he said I could understand what they were talking about in the Welsh program. So there you go. That if I ever could do that, that was an ability that's long since gone.
Yeah. How much? So you were in the north. You grew up in the northwest of England. So how much of that environment influenced your writing? Do you think? Is it just complete? Is it very connected to what you've written?
Yeah, certainly elements of it are. The northwest, Lancashire. It's yeah, it's got its own folk tales and all the rest of it. And those kind of sink into you. I recall in the early 70s, when not long after we moved into a village called Blackrod, which is bounded by Bolton and Wigan. Wrote to Wigan Pier, George Orwell, all the rest of it, Wigan. Which at the time was still primarily a colliery town. They had loads of operational pits still there.
Wow.
And indeed, the village I was in at one point, they'd all long gone by the time we moved there in '69. But like in the 19th century, there was something like 11 pits in this tiny village. They were fairly shallow pits, but there were a lot of them. Anyway, when we first moved, we didn't have a washing machine. So we used a laundrette at the top of the road.
Yeah.
And my mum got chatty with the lady who ran it, and she lent my mum this big old book. And it was a book of kind of Lancastrian history, a lot of which was local. And it specifically talked about the village I was in at one point, saying that it had there was a legend from the 17th or 18th century of there's a lane there called Dark Lane. And that's a very good name for it because there's no street lighting down there. It's a lane that runs between fields.
Yeah.
There's no street lighting. It's pitch dark down there overnight. And in this book, it said that there'd been a striker spotted there. Now, England, well, Britain as a whole, but particularly England, has got a real preponderance of black dog stories, big black hellhoundy sort of things, Barguest and so on and so forth. Wales as well, in fact. Skriker is the northwestern iteration of this, and its particular trick is that it can imitate the cry of a baby or a young child in distress, and uses it to lure people out where they can be ambushed.
Right.
By this cow-sized black dog with glowing red eyes. And there was this story. There was one down this road. That's always stayed with me. I mean, I wasn't even 10 years old when I heard that story. And I was like, I went, oh, Dark Lane, that's like half a mile that way. And I was like, what? So, yeah, it's got its local legends. From back of our house, you could see the West Pennines. And up there, there's a place called Winter Hill and Rivington. And you know, A Monster Calls, the book. It was also filmed. They filmed it up there, up on Rivington. And up there is a place called Rivington Pike, which is a bump on the top of the hill, which is artificial. It was built as a base for a signal fire. And back in the times of the Spanish Armada, if the Armada was sighted, they'd light signal fires across the country to raise the defences. And at some point, a building was built up there, and it's just a kind of cubic building, and it was there as a shelter for people out of the moors. And there's a story that turns out this vicar did this bumper collection of northwestern folk tales, and one of them is that a hunting party was out on the moors and it started pouring down, and so they went, oh right, we'll go in this building until the rain slows down a bit. So they were in there, and they see riding across towards a moor, a figure on horseback, and they go, there's something really rum about him. And he rides up, he's got no head. And like 15 people who swore to this at the time, and they went, oh heck, and he rode away again. So yeah, headless horsemen, we've got it all around there. Big black dogs that make noises like crying babies, and headless horsemen. We're completely rigged out with ghosts.
I'm starting to see the template here. The formative cocktail of Jonathan L. Howard has really come into play with everything.
Yeah. It was lovely up on the West Pennines. It's lovely country. They've got this big row of huge transmitters up there, Winter Hill transmitters up there. That's a 1,000-footer. And it's very impressive close up. It's wide as a house, but it's barren up there, and you get the most amazing lightning storms. I used to sit there just watching, like, because only time in my life I've seen chain lightning bouncing from cloud to cloud, and sheet lightning I've seen that up there as well. Very, very nice.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I'm going to throw this little curveball question at you. I like to do this in the sci-fi chats and kind of compare it to the Voight comp, but in this case, we're giving it a horror twist. So what would tip people off to your either being human or a monster? First of all, we'll start with human. What's Jonathan L. Howard's most human quality that you know it was you?
Oh, crumbs. The most human quality.
Distinctly Jonathan.
So I can't go for innate incompetence then. Oh dear. I have no idea what marks me as human. Dorks.
Well, versus we can flip it around, because the other question is, how would people know, like, what would tip them off that you're being a monster or some sort of
well, using terms like lorks, nobody does that anymore, do they? When I was working at a software company about 10, 15 years ago now, and somebody said something that surprised me. I went, "Ooh, jinkies," and the bloke on the other side of the divider actually rose up and went, "What did you say?" So yes, I have my vocabulary has got some peculiar corners. Yeah,
love it.
I just like words, so there's all that kind of good. Yeah. But I like having good evidence. I've got an ugly habit of riffing through dictionaries. It's one of the reasons why I prefer physical dictionary.
I do too.
You can browse a physical dictionary much more easily than an online one. And yeah, it pays to increase your word powers. The Reader's Digest so wisely said.
Yeah, Very true. Everybody needs an actual dictionary, I think.
There you go. I reference Reader's Digest as well. I'm obviously a monster.
No comment.
Nah, I'm actually quite fond of the Reader's Digest.
I am too.
Yeah.
Okay, if you had to pick a monster to be, then who or what would it be?
Oh, crumbs. A monster to be. Um,
Monster
hmm,
aspirations, you know.
I think if I had to be a monster, there's the Damphia,
Mm,
who are kind of semi-vampires.
yeah,
And so you get a bunch of the advantages and pretty much none of the disadvantages. So I mean, yeah, actually, if I have to be a monster, you could do a lot worse than a Damphia.
okay, fair enough. Okay, here's a sort of more nebulous question. Like, what do you think that horror can tell us about ourselves? Because I think it's a powerful medium,
Hmm.
and I have my reasons, but I want to know what you think.
It's 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 possibly one of the best genre genres for carrying hidden weight, for having unexpected depths and all the rest of it. I as in fact, I remember Gareth saying something about this not so long ago. That as he's got older, he's become a lot less. Oh, I mustn't put a message into this. If I want to put a message into it, I'll just put the bloody message into it. I absolutely agree.
Yeah,
If I feel strongly about something and I want to say something about it, I'll
yeah,
just
why
do
not?
it.
Yeah,
And with horror, it's perhaps better at disguising that, not least because a lot of horror takes place in the real world.
true.
Um, so whether you're speaking, whether you put that over figuratively or you put it over overtly, horror is very good at carrying payloads. Again, it's always dangerous. You don't want to things become purely didactic, because that's ugly to read as well.
Yeah,
But if something positive, yeah, so yes, it's not a question of so much of I have a message and the world will hear my message. It's not like that. It's I feel strongly about this thing, and this is why I feel strongly about it,
right.
and it comes over in the story.
Yes.
Um, so it's got a kind of it's kind of got an emotional impetus to it. If it just comes over as flag waving, that's a dead story.
Yeah.
Avoid that at all costs.
Good point. That's a good lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So, what do you think's the worst writing advice you ever received?
Oh, crumbs. Worst writing advice. Uh, I've had very little writing advice. I mean, I've got some books behind me on how to write this and how to write that, and they tend to be quite specific. How to write this kind of stuff, like how to write historical stuff. Here's how you research things for particular
Yeah.
points that's going on and whatnot. Um, but kind of general um, writing advice, or worst writing advice I've ever had. Oh, the only thing I could think of is super cliche now, which is the write what you know, which is
Yeah.
obvious nonsense.
I hate that.
Absolute.
Hate it.
As soon as I heard it, I thought, well, that's bullshit. Before you start, nobody's going
Not
to
at
ever
all,
write
right?
anything except soap operas if you do that.
Yeah. And I
So
hate that too.
yeah, so yeah, that one I cannot go with.
Yep.
Uh, in
Right.
terms of writing advice, other than the obvious, I mean, the best piece of writing advice is write. It
Yeah.
always has been, it always will be. That's no secret. But I did come across a bit of writing advice. In fact, it could have been one of the old yellow how-to books that I was reading. Oh, Lord, that must be about 30 odd years ago now. When I was trying to get the impetus together to actually start writing, and then it turned out to be the games industry that gave me that. But there you go. But there was this thing which was when you write something, maybe not when you first write it, but when you reread it, be aware of different categories of readers, and there it had the type A, type B, type C, and all the rest of it. And type A is on your side, just wants to have a good story. You've got to keep up the impetus. You've got to, and it's up to type C, I think, is the one I was having in mind. He's the one who wants to laugh at your work, who wants to find something wrong that they can mock. And being the paranoid individual that I am, the type C voice is quite loud in my head saying, "Don't write that. If you write that, you just that's wrong." And that's actually one of the things that keeps my prose fairly clean. As I was saying earlier, when it goes to editors, I go through and go, "Oh, no. The type C's laughing his socks off at that. No, change that." So,
Clever.
yeah, that was. It turned out to be useful in a broader spectrum than you might think.
Okay.
Because yes, it's the idea of the super critic in your head. Well, again, what you're saying about being your own worst enemy.
Yeah.
Or own strongest critic, rather.
Oh, there's that.
Which is not necessarily the same thing.
No, not necessarily. Well, in the spirit of mentioning Gareth, he's going to pop in for a second.
Good heavens above. Good Lord, man, you were there the whole time. Hello.
It is I.
All right, you two are Bristolians these days, so.
Indeed so. First time I met Gareth was at BristolCon back in, oh God, I can't remember what year it was. It's a while back now, though.
Oh, yeah,
2009, maybe, or 2010, one of the two. It's a bit ago.
Around that time,
yeah.
And I would say the tip off of you being a monster is your habit of occasionally turning into a crow.
Core blimey.
I was waiting for you to say core blimey, so my bingo card.
Yeah.
It's when you don your big black coat at the end of the night and
yes, my plague doctor beak. Yeah, off I go.
Yeah, giveaway.
Yeah. I suppose I should explain that to anybody who's watching this and hasn't got the faintest idea. I do have a thing for crows. I'm very fond of crows.
I'm fond of ravens, so we're like right there.
Yeah. Well, call it in general. I like magpies as well. Ravens, rooks, you know.
Raven.
Start.
Big one.
Oh, Gareth said Raven mad because of course he did.
Yes. Oh yeah. And my favorite pub in Bath is the Raven, which works out very nicely.
On multiple levels, I'm sure.
It's a good pub. It's a good pub.
Yeah. So I want more Kith. It sounds like at least we're getting her world back.
Yeah.
And again, thank you for the influence, because my first epic fantasy, which is on submission right now, there's definitely some Kith to that heroine. Like, she's not Kith yet, but hopefully down the line there's going to be a lot of that sort of mercenary action for who's now currently a princess, but being a mercenary. So because I like that. And you have a series of events that pushes you and pushes you and pushes you, and you can't go back to what you were before. So that's kind of where I'm running with that one. But is there anything that I haven't asked you that you'd like for readers to know?
You just struck me, actually. You're talking about influences early, and you're holding Kith up then. Jack Vance, he was...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Jack Vance had a lot to do with Kith. And I wrote another story whose title I have inconveniently forgotten, and I can't see the issues sitting around anywhere near me. Typical. But it was published in fantasy and science fiction. Interludes with the Gun Right. That was it.
Oh.
That's very Jack Vance as well, and that's kind of highish fantasy, I guess.
Cool. Great.
So, well, mid-ish fantasy, actually, because it's got gunpowder and stuff in it. But yeah, I'm fond of Vance, and again, it's the intricacy of his prose. I love that, and that kind of takes me back into the whole thing with puzzles and all the rest of it, because Dying Earth has got its puzzly moments. So yes, I was very fond of Jack Vance as well.
Cool. Well, Jonathan, where can our viewers and listeners find you online and connect with you?
Probably best still on Twitter. I haven't abandoned it yet. I'm still filled with inertia. Despite grave misgivings about the place since last October. No reason, just sometime last year, just off the top of my head. I'm still usually found on Twitter. I do have a website which hasn't been updated in forever. I really should get onto that. But yeah, Twitter's where you can usually find me being objectionable.
All right, and that is
at Jonathan L. Howard, all as one single string. Yeah.
Great. Jonathan, thank you so much for being on, and
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and Ad Astra.